all, and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and another Florida Amazing 10. This is one of the most unusual states in America. East of the Mississippi, it's one of the last to achieve statehood and be developed. It's almost entirely on a peninsula, except for the part that's a panhandle. It has the longest coastline, except for Alaska, and is the closest to the equator, except for Hawaii. Its highest point is the lowest of any state, and its coastline is protected by barrier islands, which really don't protect it all that well from hurricanes. It has some 30,000 lakes, including the second largest natural freshwater lake in the lower 48 states. Florida is unusual enough to warrant explaining some of the terminology that we use to describe the state. So in this video, I'll explore the Sunshine State from top to bottom using technology that's directly connected to Florida and its tourism. Kennedy Space Center is where nearly all of America's satellites start their trip away from Earth, and some, like those of the Landsat program, spend their working lives taking images of the Earth. The Landsat program is one of NASA's most successful and longest running satellite programs. The program's first imaging satellite was launched in 1972, with the ninth having been launched in 2021. It's a joint enterprise with the United States Geological Survey. While Landsat 6 failed to achieve orbit, the other 8 satellites have been continuously surveying the entire Earth for the past 52 years. Indeed, as of 2024, the 3 most recent satellites launched are currently operating. So let's take a look at the state of Florida and 10 of its amazing features, starting with the shape of the state itself.
Amazing history fact number 1. The peninsula. A peninsula is a piece of land that extends from a mainland and is surrounded by water on nearly all sides. Florida is the 11th largest peninsula in the world, though it comes behind Alaska in ranking in the U.S. It's bordered by the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Straits of Florida, which separates the Keys from Cuba. The word peninsula comes from a Latin term that means almost an island, entering the English language in the 16th century. Florida is 447 miles or 721 kilometers long north to south, yet varies only from 100 to 140 miles wide, about 240 kilometers. The Florida Peninsula has several of its own peninsulas, with 2 helping to define the shape of Tampa Bay as well as Cape Sable, the southernmost point on the U.S. mainland. Florida is the flattest state, though there's a ridge in the middle of the peninsula from Lake County to Highlands County. Known as the Lake Wales Ridge, it can be seen in this image. Its high point is Sugarloaf Mountain near Claremont at 312 feet or 95 meters above sea level. The ridge is the remnants of islands that were the only part of Florida to be above sea level 2 million years ago. Apart from their height, they can be distinguished by the white sand that covers them, ancient beach sand. In this video, I thought I'd include some of the worst hurricanes that hit Florida over the years to provide a perspective of their size with that of the state. This is Hurricane Dorian, an extremely powerful and catastrophic Category 5 storm in 2019. It's the most intense hurricane to strike the Bahamas and is tied with the 1935 Labor Day hurricane for the strongest landfall in the Atlantic in terms of sustained winds of 185 miles per hour. Landfall in the Bahamas saw most structures flattened or swept out to sea, and 70,000 people left homeless. Florida was spared similar destruction as Dorian curved northward. The state wasn't as lucky with Hurricane Wilma in 2005. It was the second most intense hurricane in the Western Hemisphere after Patricia in 2015. Wilma hit Florida with sustained winds of 120 miles per hour, making landfall just south of Marco Island. Amazing history fact number 2. The Panhandle. The second of Florida's main regions makes up the northwest of the state. Panhandle is a term coincidentally similar to peninsula. However, while peninsula describes a physical landform, panhandle is used to define a government area. Florida's panhandle separates the state from Georgia and Alabama. The term comes from the narrow handle of a frying pan, and instead of being bordered mostly by water, panhandles can be completely landlocked, though in Florida's case it runs along the Gulf of Mexico. Florida's panhandle is narrow and elongated, looking roughly like an actual panhandle, though the peninsula, which is arguably the pan, shows that there's only so far one can go with an analogy. 18 of the state's 67 counties are considered part of the Panhandle, with the only sizable cities being Pensacola, the capital of Spanish West Florida, and Tallahassee, the capital of Florida since 1824. It was chosen at the time because it was near the midpoint of Florida's two population centers, Pensacola and St. Augustine. This part of the state is divided into three sections by a pair of rivers that run from Alabama and Georgia to the Gulf, the Escambia and the Apalachicola. It's also the northernmost area of Florida that sports freshwater springs which tap the Florida aquifer. The most notable in the area is in Wakulla Springs State Park, located south of Tallahassee. The cave that the springs flow through bottoms out at 350 feet or 107 meters. That's deeper than the highest point in the state, Britton Hill, at 345 feet, and which is also in the Panhandle. 2018's Hurricane Michael was yet another powerful and destructive storm that became the first Cat 5 hurricane to make landfall in the contiguous United States since Andrew in 1992. Making landfall at Mexico Beach, it was the third most intense hurricane based on barometric pressure to hit the contiguous U.S. behind the 1935 Labor Day hurricane and Hurricane Camille in 1969. Amazing history fact number 3. The Keys. This final region of Florida is a remarkable string of 1,700 islands along a gentle curve 200 miles or 320 kilometers long. Starting with Soldier Key, located 5 miles due south of Key Biscayne, the islands, no more than a few feet above sea level, stretch south and then to the west, ending in the Dry Tortugas 65 miles west of Key West. They run along the edge of the Florida Platform, part of the continental shelf. At the edge, the depth of the water plunges from around 300 feet or 91 meters down to 4,000 feet or 1,200 meters. The term key comes from the Spanish word cayo, which in turn was borrowed from the Taino word for island, Cairi. The Taino were the indigenous people that lived on most of the Caribbean islands before the time of European colonization. A key is defined as a low-elevation, sandy island on the surface of a coral reef. As such, they only exist in the tropics and are formed when currents wash sediment across a reef and slowly deposit it on top. Gradually, layers of sediment build up to form land. While known collectively as the Florida Keys, only some of them are correctly referred to as Key Islands. The majority of them are relics of a warm interglacial period 125,000 years ago when sea levels were higher. The sea was shallow enough that massive communities of coral flourished just below the surface and built up the reefs. When a subsequent ice age took hold, sea levels dropped and the tops of some reefs began to emerge. Over time, the exposed reefs hardened and fossilized, making the limestone formations that peak above the water's surface today. As you might guess, the Keys share a similar history with the southern tip of Florida. The Everglades and Miami region rest on the Miami Limestone Formation. That's also the foundation of the southern Keys from Big Pine Key to the Tortugas. North of Big Pine rests the Key Largo Formation, which is similar but was formed with different species of corals, mollusks, and algae. The important thing to take from this is that most of South Florida is made up of the exoskeletons of tiny life forms. When you think of it, Florida's 3 regions all have something in common. Each is long and narrow, and with the driving distance between furthest points, the small community of Walnut Hill to Key West being a remarkable 862 miles or 1,390 kilometers. That's nearly the distance between Jacksonville and New York City. The 1935 Labor Day hurricane is known for the holiday on which it hit Florida. At the time, the practice was to name hurricanes based on the location of impact or a significant date. Beginning in 1954, female names were used. It wouldn't be until 1979 that male names were included. Centered on Long Key, the Labor Day hurricane was extremely powerful, devastating the Keys and parts of the mainland. Until 1988, it was the most intense Atlantic hurricane in terms of barometric pressure, as well as the strongest storm in terms of sustained winds. It's one of just 4 Cat 5 hurricanes to strike the contiguous U.S. Amazing history fact number 4, the Barrier Islands. Of course, the Keys aren't the only islands in the state. If you'll excuse the pun, one of Florida's key features are the long and narrow barrier islands that ring much of its coastline. It's 1,350 miles or 2,200 kilometers long, but oddly enough, it's difficult to say how much of that is considered barrier islands. These islands are made up of a sand dune system separate from the mainland, with the dunes formed by wave and tidal action parallel to the mainland. The islands usually occur in chains and they're semi-permanent, being subject to change during storms and other actions. Parts of an island can be washed away, sometimes creating an inlet, dividing an island into 2, and they can even disappear altogether. Barrier islands absorb energy and protect coastlines from the same storms that form and change them. They also create areas of protected waters where wetlands flourish. The unpredictable nature of barrier islands is one reason that it's difficult to quantify them. This was especially true prior to the early 20th century, before dredging equipment was invented. It wasn't unusual for an inlet to be filled in or created by a passing hurricane. The more recent dredging equipment is another reason for confusion. While there appears to be many barrier islands in Florida, some of them have been artificially created by digging canals to connect various estuaries, thereby making an island out of a part of the mainland. The canals were dredged to aid navigation, and today they're often part of the intracoastal waterway. The purpose of the waterway is to provide a sheltered navigable route for smaller watercraft from New England to Florida and on to Texas. Florida's barrier islands are some of the most popular places that tourists visit. These islands are where the majority of its beaches lie, from Perdido Key to St. George Island, Anclote Key south to Marco Island, and Key Biscayne to Amelia Island. 2022's Hurricane Ian was an extremely destructive Cat 5 storm and was the deadliest to strike the state of Florida since 1935. With sustained winds of 160 miles per hour, it's the strongest hurricane to hit Florida since Michael in 2018, making landfall at Cayo Costa Island. Amazing history fact number 5, Tampa Bay. Located on the west coast in central Florida, this natural harbor is one of the busiest ports in the U.S. It's the largest estuary in Florida, comprising some 400 square miles or 1,000 square kilometers. As large as it is, the bay only has an average depth of 12 feet or under 4 meters. It's fed by a number of smaller rivers, most notably the Hillsborough and the Manatee, and is made up of 6 smaller bays that merge into the main bay. Interestingly, Tampa Bay is quite young, likely forming about 6,000 years ago out of an ancient freshwater lake. Geologists hypothesize that the bay formed because of a rising sea level along with a giant sinkhole at the bay's mouth. It's possible that the opening of the mouth happened within a very short time, depending on how large the sinkhole was and how it collapsed. There were indigenous communities living in the region as early as 10,000 years ago, so there may have been human witnesses to the formation of the bay. There are a number of barrier islands at the mouth of the bay, with Egmont Key being the location of the Waterways Lighthouse and Mullet Key the site of Fort DeSoto, which today is a popular Pinellas County park. Amazing history fact number 6, the Big Bend region. It's some 200 miles or 340 kilometers of the state's coastline, and is distinctly different than the rest. While there's no hard definition to its borders, I look at it as lying between Apalachicola and Tarpon Springs. Much of the coast remains undeveloped and contains extensive salt marshes, mangrove forests, and seagrass meadows. There's little in the way of natural beaches as the coast is covered in vegetation. It's dominated by Apalachee Bay, which is technically the Big Bend of the region. With the exception of the 10,000 Islands and Everglades, this is the least populated coastline in Florida and is sparsely dotted with small settlements whose existence is centered on fishing. The area is also rather well known for some of Florida's most colorful place names: Tate's Hell State Forest, Bald Point, Bowlegs Point, the Crooked River, and Dead Man Bay, which is fed by Steinhatchee River, a name derived from the Creek language which means Dead Man's Creek. The most famous of Florida's rivers also empties into the Gulf here. That'd be the Swanee, a river that emerges from Georgia's Okefenokee Swamp and winds through North Florida, taking 250 miles or 400 kilometers when the straight line path is less than half that. As the river passes through Big Shoal State Park, it has rapids that earn a Class 3 whitewater classification, and only experienced canoe and kayakers should attempt to navigate them. Known as a blackwater river because of its dark brown waters laden with organic material, the river branches as it approaches the Gulf, creating an estuary of mud flats, salt marshes, and tidal creeks that become the Swanee Sound. When it empties into the Gulf, its dark waters act like a tracer, revealing where the fresh water mixes with the sea. The outflow of the Swanee dramatically changes the color of the Gulf and provides a great deal of nutrients to sea life that inhabit the region. The area is protected from the sea by a network of sandbars and oyster reefs, and while seagrass is common throughout the region, here it's rare because the dark water doesn't allow sunlight to penetrate to the sea floor. Amazing history fact number 7. Cape Canaveral. Looking at Florida's east coast, it's easy to notice the one prominent feature on the relatively smooth and straight coastline. Located roughly in the center is a cape, a headland, extending into the Atlantic, and it's obvious even from space. Cape Canaveral was charted by the earliest Spanish explorers as an important navigation landmark. From the perspective of a ship, Florida's coast is quite homogeneous, with barrier islands being about the only features. Cape Canaveral was so important that the name is the third oldest surviving European place name in the U.S., with Florida being the oldest and the Dry Tortugas coming next. By the way, while the island of Puerto Rico was settled before Florida, and both the place names Puerto Rico and San Juan are older than Florida, early in the island's Spanish history they were flipped. Christopher Columbus named the island San Juan Bautista, while later the town was given the formal name Ciudad de Puerto Rico de San Juan Bautista. When you think about it, it makes more sense for the town to be called a rich port than the island itself. Canaveral means reed bed in Spanish and refers to the marshy areas behind the sand dunes. The Cape is almost entirely owned by the federal government and is split up in a number of different agencies, with the best known being Kennedy Space Center, the nation's primary space launch facility, which has been in use since 1950. Because of the popularity of space exploration, KSC is the most popular non-theme park attraction in the state. Nearby is the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station that functions as the military's launch facilities, though the military also uses KSC. The Cape also has a pair of conservation areas, Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge and Canaveral National Seashore. At 528 square miles or 1,368 square kilometers, those areas, along with parts of KSC, form one of the larger areas of undeveloped Florida. Merritt Island is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, while the seashore is part of the National Park Service. The Cape is roughly divided up into two areas, the Cape itself and Merritt Island. While the Cape functions as a barrier island, it's actually connected with Merritt Island. And guess what? Merritt Island is actually part of the mainland and is a peninsula that ends in a needle-like spit of land named Dragon Point. Amazing history fact number 8, Lake Okeechobee. While it's often said that it's known as the Big O, locals refer to it just as Okeechobee or the lake. It's also called the second largest natural freshwater lake contained entirely within the contiguous 48 states after Lake Michigan. That's true, although that's a rather long description. More simply put, it's big. So big you can't see across it, though you can see a water tower in Moorhaven from the shore at Port Mayaca, at least if you have a powerful camera lens and it's a clear day. Okeechobee is famous for fishing, with regular bass tournaments held throughout the year. Other than agriculture, fishing is the primary economy for lake communities. The lake covers 730 square miles or 1,900 square kilometers, though it's quite shallow for a lake of its size, with an average depth of only 9 feet. That's nearly impossible to imagine for a lake that's 20 to 30 miles wide, and for larger boats it's important to stay within the dredged channels. Okeechobee is surrounded by a massive dike that was completed in 1937. Known as the Herbert Hoover Dike, it was expanded in the 1960s and remains there to prevent flooding. The reason for its construction was the earliest of Florida's most damaging tropical storms, the 1928 Lake Okeechobee hurricane. Barreling through Palm Beach County to hit its namesake, it's the deadliest storm, killing an estimated 2,500 people in Florida. Nearly all the fatalities happened around Lake Okeechobee and devastated the families of migrant farm workers, most of whom were black. Hundreds of square miles were flooded to depths as great as 20 feet or 6 meters, and wreaked destruction on Belle Glade, Pahokee, Canal Point, and South Bay. The storm's white victims received a formal burial service in West Palm Beach. In contrast, the bodies of black victims were burned in funeral pyres or thrown into mass burial sites in West Palm and Port Mayaca. Along with the dike, as well as canals that siphon off water for agriculture and drinking water, there are two major canals that make up what's known as the Okeechobee Waterway, which was also completed in 1937. The St. Lucie Canal on the eastern shore of the lake connects with the South Fork of the St. Lucie River near Stewart, while the Caloosahatchee Canal connects with the Caloosahatchee River, which flows to Fort Myers. Neither river was originally connected to Lake Okeechobee, but the waterway allows navigation through the state from the Atlantic to the Gulf for larger watercraft, such as U.S. Coast Guard cutters similar to this one. Amazing history fact number 9, the Everglades. This last January, I visited Everglades National Park with a good friend. It was their first time to see it, so I loved having a chance to experience it through fresh eyes. If you're used to exploring Florida, you know just how flat it is. But once you get to the Everglades, you soon realize that there's Florida flat and there's Everglades flat. The Everglades isn't a swamp, and it isn't an estuary or a lagoon. What it is one of Florida's largest rivers. Fed primarily by Lake Okeechobee, with much of the water coming from Central Florida, it sits on top of the Miami Limestone Formation and drains, ever so slowly, into Florida Bay at the southernmost point of the peninsula. The Everglades are comprised of vast flat wetlands, together with coastal and marine ecosystems. There are 9 distinct habitats: marine seagrass beds, mangrove forests, a dense ecosystem in salt and brackish water, coastal lowlands that lie between salt and fresh water, cypress domes with the impressive bald cypress and a great place to find alligators, freshwater sloughs, the riverbeds of the Everglades, freshwater marl prairies, areas that are slightly drier than the sloughs, pine rocklands, the most endangered communities in the Everglades, and the hardwood hammocks, the last part of the Everglades to flood. The remarkable diversity of habitats is determined by altitude, with dramatic changes occurring with as little as 1 foot change in elevation. The river itself flows at 1/4 of a mile a day. That means water from Lake Okeechobee could take more than a year to reach the sea. The Everglades is roughly 100 miles long and 40 to 70 miles, or 64 to 112 kilometers wide. The southern half of the Everglades was designated as Everglades National Park in 1934. It's the third largest park in the contiguous states, the largest wilderness east of the Mississippi, and the largest tropical wilderness in the country. In 1976, it was also designated the Everglades and Dry Tortugas Biosphere Reserve by UNESCO. Biosphere reserves are areas comprising terrestrial, marine, and coastal ecosystems. UNESCO further designated the Everglades as a World Heritage Site in 1979. Heritage sites are places determined to be unique landmarks which are geographically and historically identifiable, have a special cultural or physical significance, and be under legal protection. In 1987, the Everglades were chosen to be a Ramsar site through the Ramsar Convention, an international treaty for the conservation and sustainable use of wetlands. The Everglades are one of only 3 sites in the world that are on all 3 international lists. Amazing History Fact number 10. Miami and more. Known as the Magic City, Miami developed into a town later than nearly all of Florida's other cities. In 1870, it started as a trading post, but it wasn't until the 1910s that its growth took off. The city grew quickly due to its proximity to the Caribbean and South America, as well as Biscayne Bay providing a large natural harbor. By the 1970s, Miami-Dade County, Broward County, and Palm Beach County had grown into one long urban center squeezed between the Atlantic and the Everglades. The 3 counties rank as the first, second, and third most populous counties in the state and are known as the Miami metro area. As of 2023, it has a population of more than 6 million. The urbanized area is about 100 miles long and at most 20 miles wide, with some areas barely 5 miles. I've already mentioned ways that humans have modified these amazing Florida features: Kennedy Space Center, the Lake Okeechobee Dike, and artificial barrier islands. But nothing compares to the massive urban sprawl of the Miami metro area. It's easily visible from space, especially contrasting it to the neighboring Everglades. These satellite images clearly show the huge issues facing the conservation of the Everglades. Preserving that unique ecosystem gets increasingly more difficult as the Miami area continues to grow, developing every possible acre on the edge of the Everglades. In the past 23 years, the area's population has grown by 1% every year, adding more than 1 million new residents since 2000. There's little land left to develop in any direction, including northward. Bordering Palm Beach County is Martin County, which not only has agriculture and quite a lot of conservation lands, including 3 large state parks, but it also has density restrictions on both commercial and residential property. The county would have long ago succumbed to the growth if it hadn't taken the direction it did 50-plus years ago. So will the Miami metro area stop growing? Probably not. The area is already one of the most densely populated areas in the country, and Miami has the 3rd largest skyline in the U.S. The Magic City has over 300 high-rises. Plus, the city of Sunny Isles Beach is ranked 14th due to its collection of tall condos. Of the tallest buildings in Florida, over 600 feet or 183 meters, the Miami area has 28 of the 29, and only 4 of those are commercial rather than residential. So what the future holds is uncertain. Our final hurricane is Andrew, a highly compact but extremely powerful and destructive Cat 5 storm that struck South Florida in 1992. It hit Elliott Key and then hit the mainland at Homestead. It was the most destructive hurricane to ever hit Florida in terms of structures damaged, and remained the costliest in financial terms until Hurricane Irma surpassed it 25 years later. It affected hundreds of homes in the Miami area, destroying hurricane-safe structures down to their concrete slabs.
So that's a look at 10 amazing areas of Florida, all which can be explored through satellite images. This state is quite unlike any other, with its 2 coastlines, flat terrain, an exceptional number of lakes and islands, black water rivers, and white sand beaches. So much of what I've covered are popular destinations for Florida's tourists, whether bass fishing on the Big O, boating with dolphins in Tampa Bay, watching a launch at KSC, scaling a lighthouse out on a barrier island, seeing large gators in the wild, or checking out Hullover Nude Beach near Miami. Thank you for watching another of my videos. I hope you enjoyed this look at Florida from near-Earth orbit. If you learned something, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more information on Florida's tourism history. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.